Hello and welcome to The Top Story, a podcast with the headlines of the day from our correspondents around the world. I'm Xizhi. Coming up in this edition, South Korean opposition parties have submitted a motion to impeach President Yoon Suk Yeol after he declared martial law. The UN Security Council has held an emergency meeting over Syria as the conflict intensifies. And the political crisis in France continues as Prime Minister Michel Barnier faces a no-confidence vote. We begin in Asia. Opposition parties in South Korea have submitted a motion to impeach President Yoon Suk Yeol, who declared an emergency martial law on Tuesday night. Yoon lifted the law on Wednesday after the National Assembly voted against it. He said he issued the order to eradicate anti-state forces and uphold free constitutional order. Nearly 200 lawmakers from the main opposition Democratic Party and 5 other minor opposition parties proposed a motion to oust Yoon from office. They plan to vote on the motion between Friday and Saturday. The office of the president has defended the attempt to declare the martial law, saying it is justified and within the bounds of constitution. It also denied that martial law forces interfered with lawmakers' access to parliament. Cabinet ministers have expressed intentions to resign en masse to Prime Minister Han Duck-soo. The senior presidential staff also offered to resign. Prime Minister Han has expressed a willingness to serve the public until the final moment. The martial law decree is the first such declaration issued in South Korea since the military dictatorship ended in the late 1980s. Jack Barton has more.
Many South Koreans didn't even know that one of the most dramatic turns in the last 5 decades in their country had actually happened till they woke up. Many of them then heading down to the National Assembly to protest on the steps, to call for the impeachment of President Yoon Suk Yeol or to call for him to step down immediately and avoid that process. 190 lawmakers pushed through the military, some climbing over the fence, the military breaking windows to try and stop them get in, to try and seize control of the assembly. But once inside, they had that vote overturning the state of martial law. The army said they would not leave these premises until the president had given them the order to do so, which he did around 4:30, accepting that vote inside the assembly. But of course, the big question, what comes next? This may be a little calm before the storm, not the calm after the storm, because what we're hearing is there are growing calls for the president to step down. Many of his key aides have offered to resign, and ministers, even within his own party. The head of the People Power Party has said that the party is embarrassed by this, that they were caught off guard, that it was a serious mistake, and that change must happen. So it sounds like even within his own party, there are moves to really get rid of President Yoon and get him to step down. People are very angry about this state of martial law, so reminiscent of the military dictatorship. Nothing like this has really happened since 1979, and people say it should never have happened in the first place. Just because President doesn't have a majority in the National Assembly and can't get his budget and other measures through, nobody sees that as a serious reason to declare martial law.
That was Jack Barton on the political chaos in South Korea. On the Middle East, the United Nations Security Council has held an emergency meeting over Syria as the conflict intensifies. The Syrian rebels captured the city of Aleppo last week, reigniting the war. Popping Putin has more.
In a surprise lightning attack last Wednesday, rebels in Syria captured the town of Aleppo in a blow to Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. The rebel coalition, led by an al-Qaeda offshoot, has continued its push into surrounding territory in northwestern Syria in a rapidly escalating onslaught that continued Tuesday as rebel groups closed in on the city of Hama. The Syrian government is striking back with air support from its international ally, Russia. The UN Security Council convened an emergency meeting Tuesday at the request of the Syrian government.
My first core message today is simple. We need de-escalation and we need calm. I appeal to all parties to their obligations under international law to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure and allow safe passage for Syrians fleeing violence.
The rebel attack in Syria has reignited a war that began in 2013 and has been dormant since 2020, when a Russia-Turkey brokered ceasefire took hold. The fighting in Syria is further destabilizing the Middle East, playing out against the backdrop of Israel's wars against Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon. The Syrian government was also largely insulated from rebel attacks in recent years, with support from allies Iran and Hezbollah, currently engaged in protracted conflicts in the region, with limited ability to fight off the rebels.
That was Popman Putin reporting. Meanwhile, the Syrian Defense Ministry says additional troops have been deployed to Hama province. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights says fighting has erupted between government forces and the Syrian Democratic Forces in Deir ez-Zor. It adds that the fighting has left hundreds of people dead, including civilians. Ray Addison reports.
In Syria, the death toll is rising. The United Nations says dozens of civilians have been killed, including women and children, with claims that both government and rebel forces are responsible. Warplanes had hit residential areas of Aleppo, along with medical facilities and a displaced people's camp in Idlib province, resulting in several fatalities, including children. In rebel-held Aleppo, Syrian local media says insurgents have formed a so-called military government and imposed a curfew, prompting thousands of residents to flee in search of safety. Meanwhile, a food crisis is looming in the city as residents struggle to snap up essential supplies amid the ongoing conflict. The UN says more than 48,000 people have been displaced in the country so far, and key infrastructure, including schools and water stations, have been damaged as the fighting continues. Rebels have already captured a swathe of land across the northwest of the country and say they're making further gains. However, the Syrian government says it has killed hundreds of fighters in recent days. The country's state news agency says the army is reinforcing defensive lines in the countryside surrounding the central city of Hama ahead of a planned attack. Meanwhile, sources say at least 300 Iraqi fighters have now crossed into Syria to support the military. Troops such as these proved key to the success of pro-government forces when rebels rose up against President Bashar al-Assad in 2011. However, with Russian support stretched due to the conflict in Ukraine and Hezbollah's leadership in Lebanon refusing to send troops, it remains to be seen what impact they will have.
That was Ray Addison with the latest on the Syria conflict. Elsewhere in the Middle East, Israel has launched an airstrike on the southern Lebanese town. The attack in Sheba that killed a person came amid a fragile truce between Israel and Hezbollah. Both sides have accused each other of repeated ceasefire violations. Israel has warned that it will expand attacks and include targets linked to the Lebanese state if the truce collapses. Jonathan Regev has more from Tel Aviv.
Both sides seem to blame the other for violations. The two rockets that were fired from Hezbollah yesterday afternoon came, according to Hezbollah, in response to Israeli breaches of violations. This is according to what the organization is saying. There have been, according to Hezbollah, some 50 incidents or so in which Israel fired towards Lebanon. And shortly after those rockets fired from Lebanon came the Israeli response with fire towards Hezbollah installations. We're hearing of at least 15 people in Lebanon being killed. Having said all that, both sides, Israel and Lebanon, not Israel and Hezbollah, but Israel and Lebanon, have reiterated to the American mediators that they will continue to comply with the ceasefire agreement, meaning it is still in place, but it's very, very fragile, meaning it can collapse at any minute. We can see that there are constant incidents, constant violations of both sides. Both sides are saying that the other is violated it. So the ceasefire is in place. Yes. Is it at risk of collapsing? Also yes. And we've visited the communities in northern Israel this week. They're still empty. People are still not coming back because of sort of a lack of faith in this ceasefire, which we'll see exactly a week since it was signed. But it's very, very fragile at this time.
That was Jonathan Regev reporting from Tel Aviv. Finally, in Europe, the political crisis in France is continuing as Prime Minister Michel Barnier and his government face a no-confidence vote. The country is struggling to tame a massive budget deficit. Ross Cullen reports.
MPs will be debating the no-confidence votes. They will be already in transit through Parliament. And then around 7 p.m. local time, Michel Barnier will be facing the music as lawmakers go to vote in favour or against the no-confidence motion. There are two that have been submitted. The first one by the left-wing alliance, the New Popular Front, and the second one by the far-right National Rally, their parliamentary leader, Marine Le Pen, saying the time has come to push forward with this, her party voting in favour, she says, of any no-confidence motions that are submitted. So they're going to vote for their own, of course. She's also said that she would be voting for the one that has been put down by the left-wing alliance. So if everybody votes according to their party political position, then Michel Barnier will be out of a job. If you lose a no-confidence vote as Prime Minister, then it is customary you will be submitting your resignation to the President, who can then refuse to accept it and reappoint you, or can choose to embark upon another journey of trying to find a new premier. Now, bear in mind, Jamie, it took Emmanuel Macron weeks over the summer following the inconclusive election on the 7th of July to finally appoint Michel Barnier at the end of the summer as Prime Minister. And if he were to lose the no-confidence votes tomorrow, he would be the shortest-serving Prime Minister in modern French history. And it would be the first time that a French government has collapsed since 1962.
That was Ross Cullen on a political crisis in France. Now, recapping the headlines, South Korean opposition parties have submitted a motion to impeach President Yoon Suk Yeol after he declared martial law. The UN Security Council has held an emergency meeting over Syria as the conflict intensifies. And the political crisis in France is continuing as Prime Minister Michel Barnier faces a no-confidence vote. And that's it for this edition of The Top Story, a podcast that brings you world headlines every weekday. For more news in politics, business, sports and culture, you can subscribe to the Beijing Hour, a one-hour podcast news magazine program. We welcome and appreciate all ratings and reviews. I'm Qi Zhi. Thanks for listening.